conversation. So welcome everyone to our monthly Mahoosic Way Zoom room discussion. For those of you who don't know, I'm Mike Wilson with the Northern Forest Center, sitting in for our usual MC, which is Jessie Perkins from the Bethel Area Chamber of Commerce, who is under the weather with a sore throat, so we're giving her a break today. But we're excited to see everyone today for a chance to, again, to dive in, at least informally, to talk about something that we know is a pressing issue in the Mahoosic region and in the context of thinking about sustainable tourism, which is housing availability and the tightness of that market right now, and the challenge that people are finding either to find homes to buy or to rent. So we are pleased today to be joined by two guests. First is Cara Wilbur, as you saw in the invitation. She's an experienced regional planner who is shifted over and is involved full-time with community-based real estate development. She works with retail, industrial, mixed-use projects, historic rehabilitation, infill, and we've found her to be a wealth of information, knowledge, and good thinking on this issue. And our second speaker, who wasn't in the invitation material, is Brian Eng. He's a partner with Maine Cooperative Development Partners. He's been involved in a number of development projects in Florida, Connecticut, New Jersey, and here in Maine. He's been the principal developer on over 200 units. He was involved in redevelopment of the old Merck site down in Biddeford and several other smaller projects in Maine. And again, has been, based on our conversations, just a great creative thinker on this. So we're really pleased to have Brian with us today. Our format today will be a little bit different than past Zoom rooms, where in past cases, we've typically invited someone who's involved with a local project to come and just give an update on that work and field questions on it. This time, we're going to set it up as a little bit more of a dialogue, where I'm going to offer a couple tee up a few questions for Cara and Brian to respond to together to get us started, and then we'll just take 10 or 15 minutes with that, and then we'll open it up to questions and discussion with you all. Does that make sense? Anyone have any questions on that or any comments before we dive in? Okay, well, with that, Cara and Brian, I invite you to come off mute. Say hello.
Hello. Do you want me to introduce myself, or do you feel like
that would be great if you both want to take just a minute to set this up in addition to my effort.
I thought your effort was good. Like mentioned, I'm a planner and developer, working mostly in communities, Lewiston and North, Lewiston, Rumford, Gardner, and also looking at Sanford and some other places, Madison. And also chair the Build Maine Conference, which is coming up in June in Skowhegan, and I hope everyone will check into that because it's a really great event. And that's all I really have to say. Brian? Can't hear you.
Hey, Brian.
I don't know what kind of technology problems I'm having here.
There you go. Well, we appreciate you dialing in from your phone. We can hear you.
I think you maybe should just press on, and I'm going to try to find a better spot here and rejoin the meeting.
We can hear you okay now.
Yeah.
Okay, maybe he can't hear us. All right. Well, with that, we'll let Brian drive down the road a little bit farther and see if he can reconnect. So, Cara, you're on the spot. Again, just to get things started, again, I think everyone on the call is pretty aware of the tight nature of the housing market in Bethel and the greater Mahoosic region, where, as I said, there's a lot of pressure from second home development, Airbnb, and just a limited number of units available either for sale or for rent. And so we've all heard lots of horror stories about people looking for a really long time to try to find a place to be able to settle and stay in the region. So given that context and your experience and connections across the state, just wondering if you can share a few examples of approaches other communities, particularly kind of rural destination communities, have taken to address the shortage of what we're typically thinking about in these conversations is that mid-tier attainably priced housing for sale or for rent.
Yep. I think one thing we've seen across the state is that there's been a challenge getting housing in closer to our towns in particular, in our service centers. So as a result, a lot of new development has been in the form of single family homes, which are, approved as of right in more rural areas. Most of our rural lands are zoned for 1 and 2 acre lots. And so it's easy for someone to go lop off some acres, put up some single family homes. And usually the price points are, higher because they're bigger houses and lower because they're it's cheaper development in some ways because it's on rural, less expensive land. But in either case, it's further outside of our communities. So a lot of towns have been trying to figure out how do we incentivize development back in our service centers and the walkable parts of our communities so we can, support business and get people closer to their jobs and reduce traffic and all those things. So one strategy that some towns have taken is really studying their zoning to figure out what's a barrier to development in our in-town locations. And oftentimes what people are seeing is that there's been suburban zoning overlaid on top of our walkable community centers that have really big minimum lot sizes that don't actually match the fabric of the neighborhoods that are there. And so measuring and studying what people do love about the sort of village centers in town areas is a great strategy that's being adopted, where communities are saying like, oh, our in-town lots are actually only 50 feet wide, but we have them zoned for a minimum of 200. And if you address that, then you can get 4 times as much housing. There's also minimum units per acre or square footage requirements that can oftentimes limit how much housing you can get in the places where you already have your infrastructure. So some of those strategies are really helpful, just a really fine-tuned surgical, study of your code. And then some towns have even taken it a step further and said, we want to make it super clear what we would like built in our towns, and have looked at building types such as, small houses, duplexes, fourplexes, or other mixed use buildings that can kind of fit in an infill way into the fabric of a downtown, and put those into the zoning. So it's very clear, like this is the kind of development we want to see, and then made it easier to kind of move those projects through their approval process. So there's both sort of the surgical and then sort of more full, rethink of zoning away from the suburban use-based approach, more to a form approach that creates more flexibility in terms of the uses and the number of units and such like that.
One quick clarification, I guess, I think as you probably know, I don't think any of the communities in the Mahoosic area, maybe Newry, actually have formal
Zoning, right.
So I know we're using the word zoning, but is it fair to to swap that out with kind of local building codes and things like that?
Well, yeah, and I would actually swap it out more with site plan and subdivision. Those tend to exist in communities that don't technically have zoning. So in a lot of your communities, you're actually not regulating use as much, but you might be regulating setbacks, and you might be regulating lot widths as part of your subdivision or site plan review. Varies from town to town.
And parking requirements too, right,
and
Cara?
parking, yeah, absolutely.
And are there, welcome, Brian.
Yeah, sorry about my technical difficulties
You,
before.
you've
And
made a
then,
big
and then,
transition.
yeah, well, I am using public spaces. I'm in a public
Okay.
library, and the room that I had reserved, there was a very, I didn't want to interrupt what looked like a very productive meeting. So anyway, I'm here. And I think just catching on to some of the things that we were talking about, site plan, subdivision, parking, and then there are state regulations too, like shoreline zoning and life safety, issues that sometimes I think cause confusion when people are trying to, do things in local communities. I would say the interpretation of some state regulations like life safety by, local officials, it can sometimes, it can be a little bit confusing.
And so as you all think about this and kind of this approach to it, to updating, adjusting these kinds of rules and regulations, can you point to particular examples of communities that you think have done this well? And again, particularly very small communities. I know that those examples might be fewer and farther between. But would love to hear just again, if you have them, a couple real world examples of communities that have leaned in and gotten into this in this way.
Well, there's two rural communities I can think of in Maine. One is North Yarmouth and the other is Newcastle. They both have zoning, so it's a little bit different than the towns that don't. But I think the important takeaway is that they got together as communities and decided where they wanted new housing development to go. And were proactive about making sure that their regulations didn't preclude the things they wanted from happening, which oftentimes is the case. And then they also, worked with local landowners and with potential developers, locals and outside, to figure out, where those parcels could be, and to proactively, market the vision and make sure people knew about it, so that they could help, push that stuff forward. In Newcastle, they went so far as to create a whole new set of land use regulations. In North Yarmouth, they did a more surgical approach. In both cases, it was really focused on, here's the building form that we want to see, and trying to make sure that was clear, allowable, and communicated out to the world. So I guess those are two local examples.
And then Cara, have you talked at all about the proposed legislation yet? I mean,
No.
is it worth maybe just sort of, giving a little bit of background on what's going on and your role in it? I know you don't like to talk about yourself, but
I don't know if that's super productive right now, because it's
I
such a moving target.
But it is, I think the conversation that's happening around it is very much about what we're talking about here right now. You may have noticed in the news that the Speaker of the House, Ryan Fecteau, who represents Biddeford, has proposed some legislation. I think is it LD 2003, Cara 2003. And there's certainly plenty of news coverage that you can read about, but these issues are being discussed right now in the context of, well, how can we change, regulations basically? And there's a whole, conversation going on about state level regulation versus local home rule, and, what's the right and wrong things to do. And then embedded within that conversation, and I encourage everyone to get involved, because if you care about this topic, I mean, this is really going to be relevant. And I think, we have an opportunity to shape what that legislation looks like now, and hopefully shape it in ways that are the most productive. And then, there's going to be rulemaking that will happen, administrative rulemaking that will happen after the legislation passes, and that how that gets done will matter as well. So that's, sort of very technical and high level, but that is a process that's going on right now. And if you care about this, we certainly encourage you to engage in it. And, I think we're happy to share our opinions with you about what we think it should look like, and we can talk about it more, towards the tail end of this. But even if you want to just follow up more individually later, please feel free to do so, and reach out to your state reps and senators as well. This is a big deal. It will have an impact. And then, do you want to talk about the priority zones at all, Cara, as a model? I don't know if that's something that addresses, Mike's question about, well, how can, smaller communities with less staff and less resources, how can they sort of get their arms around, something like this? And maybe, I don't know, is Rumford telling it all with like sort of the Black Mountain area? Is that
well,
an
I think
example?
that the real important thing is that people get together in their communities and decide where is it that we want housing to go, and be proactive about having those conversations, because the trajectory in the world of development is that housing goes where it's easiest and cheapest, and so that produces low density residential housing subdivisions. And so there's an argument to be made that erodes one of your best assets that you have in your region, which is your open space, and the recreation that happens in those spaces, and outdoors activities. So
and it diverts development away from your villages too, right? I think Cara is another way to think of it. Like if we think of, and I didn't, I missed the opportunity to introduce myself, but I spent a lot of time in Oxford County because I own a couple of homes in Mount Abram Village in Greenwood, and I drive through Bryant Pond Village, and I drive through Norway, South Paris, all of these village areas that we have, that there's a lot of opportunity in these already developed areas that sometimes have infrastructure like sewer and water systems to draw from. To Cara's point, without sort of a little bit of thinking about it, and sort of and I know in Greenwood, this type of planning has happened in the past. There have been like Lock Mills planning, and obviously Mount Abram Village planning work that has gone on about sort of, where do you want to see the development happen, and where does it make the most sense? Not just from like Cara said, lowest common denominator, cheapest to build, most profitable to sell or rent, but in terms of the direction you want to see your communities go and where you want to see development patterns emerge. I think there are ways to do that. And maybe Mike, like planning organizations, I think are another, resource, councils of government, or, like Community Concepts, I know has some capacity and expertise, or even the Northern Forest Center, I think could, be like a clearinghouse or a resource for thinking about these things, because it's a lot of common ideas, and it's things people already know, right, Cara? That I think is like, we know what like sensible, good development looks like. These are sort of like, I'm going to use the term prehistoric, which is sort of offensive, right? But people have always built villages in a certain way. They've clustered buildings in a certain way and created, travel corridors in a certain way and we know what it looks like. It doesn't look like a lot of, subdivisions that are centered around automobiles. It's just, that's a much more recent pattern, and it's not, I don't think it speaks to us in terms of what seems practical. So I don't know, Mike, did I respond to your question at all?
I think that's all the right kind of context, and this is the thinking that we need to be kind of pushing into the area to get into this issue. I do want to, I'm watching the clock, I do want to make space to open the floor. And I could keep asking questions, but I want to make some space and invite other folks who are in the room to step off Zoom, and we'll keep an eye out and ask any questions that you have.
I have one just off the top of my head, and I apologize, I think I missed the intros. So Cara, I'm not sure like if you're able to speak to this, but I lived in the Bay Area for 9 years, And so I've seen like the pattern of there's not enough housing, so we build apartment complexes, they become investment properties. So there's not actually like, I think it seems to me that we would need like a two pronged approach that would be like building and restrictions on Airbnb and like investment property kind of things.
Yeah.
Are you
I
able
think,
to speak to that?
yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I mean, there's an argument to supply does help, but supply on its own without some sort of, strategy to preserve affordable units or create affordable units or missing middle units, which is kind of like the workforce area in the middle. It doesn't work on its own. Like that's what the West Coast has shown us. And the good news is that Maine Housing right now is coming out with programs which are beneficial in two ways, especially for like most of Maine, which doesn't have the rents that maybe the Portland market does. It closes the gap between the cost of construction and the market rents. And it also, it helps create that sort of missing middle attainable price. And, I think 15 years is the timeline for it. So ideally it could be preserved longer. And so right now they have a program that subsidizes for sale units, $60,000 per unit, which is enough to make projects work in most of Maine, which is great, as long as you can figure out how to do it, within reason on the cost side. And then they're going to be coming out with a rental program this summer, which we don't know exactly what that's going to look like yet, but it may just be for, what do you call it, Brian?
I guess like nonprofits or sort of housing authorities,
Yeah.
nonprofit owners or housing authorities, which I think maybe gets to your question about, the sort of profit motive and what does housing mean, or even in the context of ownership, right? Because if you have gentrification or property values increase, that doesn't really help in any sort of permanent way. And so, the program that Cara is alluding to, which is the affordable home ownership program that Maine Housing is creating right now to try to produce new for sale homes that will have, restrictions, resale restrictions on them about how much you can sell them for if you resell them. I mean, that's an example of one. I think, one of the reasons Mike invited me to be on this is I'm working on a couple of projects right now where we're trying to develop, I guess, what are called maybe shared equity models that also have some restrictions on how much, people can sort of make from, reselling or moving on. There's limited equity housing cooperatives, which is a model that's been used in Lewiston and in a few other places throughout Maine. That's one structure that's out there right now. And there's also a movement, the community land trust movement, which is gaining some traction here in Maine. There's a pretty active group in Portland that's trying to do a project, and then a group in Waterville that has also been really working pretty hard to look at that structure. And, basically, I guess to say it really quickly and then see if there's any follow-ups, like those are situations where, it's different than the traditional form of home ownership that we think about, where, there's sort of a cooperative entity or a community entity that owns the land or owns the land and buildings in a way that sort of limits the ability for any individual resident to sort of make a profit and then, have that housing become sort of unattainably expensive, when that person moves and sells the property. So there are some sort of legal and financial structures like that we're working on right now as well. And there's a group in I should point out there's a group in Norway who's been looking at this too. I used the non-local examples first. I probably should have led with the group in Norway that's looking at that model as well.
Do you know what the group is by any chance in Norway?
Is anyone from the Norway group on the Zoom? I don't know the name actually, but
I would guess it would be CB.
yeah, so
Center for Ecology.
Mia just came off mute. Mia?
Yeah, I
Okay.
think it's CB, and they're
Yeah.
working in partnership with the Western Foothills Land Trust, I believe, together.
So
yeah.
I want to make space for one more question from the group before we create an off ramp for people who need to go at 12:30, but we can also stick around till 12:45. Other questions? Yeah, Rosemary. But you're on mute. You need to come off mute.
Got it. Thank you. I'm Rosemary Bond Laban. I live in Bethel. I guess the thing that, two things. One is that, people keep talking about that it's a, it's a situation, it's a whatever, it's a problem. I mean, you may as well call it what it is. It's a problem. I'm sorry. And, I personally know a couple of young people who are just really, really wanting to buy affordable housing, what we used to call starter homes. See a couple people on here my age, and we remember starter homes, and we don't have that. And my question is, are any developers on board with this? I mean, I'm from Tallahassee, Florida, and we had a developer there who had a conscience and decided to buy like 100 acres or whatever. For just math, I'm going to do it simple, and divide it up into 2-acre lots. And they built these homes, and there were very, very strict covenants that went with this, including a homeowners board, et cetera, et cetera. And people who bought in the 70s, and that, they're just now thinking about selling them, because they've lived there that long. It's been that nice. But my question is, are there any developers who are interested in doing this?
Well, Cara and I are interested, and I don't think we're alone. For what it's worth, we're trying to figure out ways to make it happen.
Okay, yeah. Like I said, it was extremely successful in Tallahassee. It still is, as far as I know. When you bought the home, you couldn't sell it for 10 years. You agreed that it would only be for single family dwellings. It would not be rented out. And they've changed it over the years, and it's not been perfect, but it was at least something that solved a problem, a real problem, and it's been going strong for, what are you into it now? 50 years?
Great. Yeah.
Thank you.
I would say too, in Bethel, one of the most attractive opportunities I think you have for plug and play development versus like something where you're having to build new infrastructure is your train station area, which, has a network of roads. And, my understanding is that there are some issues with, making it easy to do projects there. And the question is, what are those issues? And could you as a community decide, here are the things we want here, the scale of development, what kind of buildings, and then do some work to make it really easy for somebody to come in and invest and start to build that out, because you have this incredible asset right there.
Yeah, and we have a lot of land. My husband was a forester. Right. There are lots of tracts of land around here that were owned by families for years, and now either they've passed on or their children. One lives in Chicago, one lives in Boston, one lives in Denver. And so what do you do with this land? But my big thing is it's the developers who know the right questions to ask. They know all of that stuff. I don't know it. I don't know anything about any of that. But I would think until they're on board, nothing's going to happen anywhere, really.
I would flip that on its head and say that as a developer, it's really risky to go into a community that isn't super clear about what they want and where they want it. Because the reality is, if people don't like what you have in mind to do, it's not going to be a fun or easy process. And I try to find opportunities that, are infill first, because I like to invest in places where communities have already invested and where I'm not having to build new infrastructure that then someone has to figure out how to pay for in the future. And then secondly, if there is a greenfield, a new development location that's walkable, bikeable to a downtown, and you guys know where that is, and property owners that are interested in like having a legacy project where they're building a neighborhood not a subdivision, so that it can plug into your existing fabric of your downtown and support it, then that's a really great way to get yourselves organized locally. And then you can go talk to developers or, you know, attract them. Like what Auburn is doing, I think is really great. They're identifying properties and they're marketing them. They're saying, here's these properties that we think have potential. And we would like to find someone who's willing to invest. But for a developer to do that, to kind of go and like identify land without knowing what a community wants is really, it's sort of an uphill battle that most people aren't going to do.
Well, I'll flip you on your side and say that, you know, I think nothing is worse than a committee of people made up like me who doesn't know anything. I need to be taught. I need to have somebody who's been through the process to come to me and tell me initially, this is what we'd like to do. These are some things that work. These are things that don't. I mean, you get a bunch of yeomen like me out there and we don't know anything. We don't. And it's got to be frustrating for a developer. So my preference would be to have someone like you or Brian, you know, come to a town meeting or whatever and start telling us, you know, we recognize you want this. We recognize there's a situation here, a problem, you know, and here's some ideas.
Yeah.
So
I'll meet you in the middle
there.
there. I'll meet you in the middle there.
Okay.
Collaborative.
And on that note, I do want to do a quick time check. I think that's actually a really nice, good point. And I will say that, you know, we have been, the town managers from Woodstock, Greenwood, Bethel, Newry have gotten together a few times to look at this issue and have had a chance to meet with Cara, and are at least looking into the opportunity of kind of, again, this is not stuff that's going to get fixed next month, but to at least looking into the opportunity to take this kind of a look at ordinances and basically proactive things that the towns can do. Because I agree, it ultimately comes down to that meeting in the middle to some degree. So Beth, I see your hand up, but I before I take more questions, I do want to say thanks to everyone who has made some time for this today and basically give a free off ramp to anyone who booked themselves for a half hour and needs to jump off. So feel free to jump off if you would like, but otherwise I would suggest we go ahead and continue the conversation for another 10 minutes, and we will wrap up firmly at 12:45. So with that, I will ask for the question behind Beth Weisberger's box. And you're on mute.
Mike, this is Wade. I wonder if it's actually me.
I had a
not
feeling.
Andreas. It doesn't fit now, but I just wanted to say to Rosemary that I'm happy to meet with her and tell her just how absolutely infuriating it is to try to get a project through the planning board in Bethel. I think Bethel historically has this approach to development. You know, this is demonstrated by not having any zoning, that there's a laissez-faire, do what you want attitude here, but the lack of structure and rules and process makes it incredibly subjective as to what gets approved and what doesn't get approved. And so projects getting approved in this town tend to come down to personality and politics rather than transparent process and desired outcomes and what's best for the community.
Yeah, Steve, you need to come off mute.
Yeah, Steve White. We built a development here in Newry on the Sunny River Access Road, and had to use, I tried to use a cluster housing regulations according to the Newry regs, which I was involved in making. But it didn't work out. So we ended up creating our development under subdivision rule, under condominium rules. So there's single family homes on 50 by 50 plots that kind of swim in an open space beyond that, so that there's there's a feeling of separation, and yet you don't have to give everybody 2 acres and use it up. So that may be a possibility.
Cara, you're on mute.
I was just gonna say, so you couldn't use the cluster development, so what did you end up using for the zoning?
Now, Steve,
Yeah.
you're on mute.
Okay. It ended up being a condominium.
Okay, so you didn't have to go through subdivision, essentially, right?
Correct.
Or did you? No, you would have had to,
We had to go through, yeah,
subdivision.
did, but by calling it a condominium and setting it up in such a way that the services were all owned by the owners of the various properties, it worked. And it was in the
That seems-
early days of this kind of thing, so.
Yeah, that seems like a good example of a workaround,
Yeah.
Steve. But ideally, developers wouldn't have to do that kind of workaround.
Yeah.
It would be clear enough from the get-go.
Right, well, then, so the answer is maybe that the cluster housing thing wasn't set up properly. I mean, the deal with that was you were supposed to have lots of land and only use a small portion of it, so it was surrounded by open space.
Bonnie, did I just see your hand flash up? And you are also on mute?
Yeah, and then I chickened out. But what I was going to say is what you're looking at on this screen is actually the next generation of people who have been concerned about housing. I think maybe Robin was in on the last group and I was in on the last group, but we've been talking about this for decades, literally. And it's been a problem for decades, but not a crisis like it is now. So I really think we need help because our efforts as volunteers haven't really worked yet. And the things you're talking about zoning and cluster housing and condominiums and all these subdivision things, that's where Rosemary comes in. I don't have that background either. So I don't know what all the roadblocks are and have been. And Wade says the planning committee is a pretty big roadblock. So we need help to wade, I get it, through the bureaucracy surrounding this to get something built. And I agree, if there are developers who could put the profit motive second to the philanthropy motive, that might really help us.
I think based on what I'm hearing, I do think having a visioning process where you guys actually like identify where you want housing and what you want it to look like, and somehow memorializing that so that it's something the planning board, like, so the planning board reviews applications or projects against, you know, more explicit and clear direction around building types, could be a strategy. So you're front loading the work and clarifying the process and the outcomes on the front end. And so then it would be easier for anybody to come in and build that. Might be a strategy where you're not creating a whole, you know, confusing zoning code, but you're creating a set of building types that you say as a community, this is what we want, and this is where we want them. And there's some towns not in Maine, no one's done this yet, but they've done this sort of pattern zoning where they've gone so far as to say, here's some pre-approved building types. If you build these building types in these places, you're pre-approved and you're just coming in for a building permit. So technically, I haven't gotten into the nitty gritty of how that would work with subdivision and site plan regulations that exist at the state level and local level. But I think that that could be a path forward, and there is conversation happening about how do we fix main subdivision rules, because if you're building a 4-unit building, like an infill building that looks like a house from the outside, but is 4 units on the inside, right now you have to go through subdivision to get that building put into your town center, even though it looks like every other building in the town center and it's not subdividing the land. So I mean, we have some like fundamental state level issues we're trying to resolve in the next couple of years, but there could be a path forward where you guys could, pre-approve, get pretty clear about building types and help get some things happening. And paired with the main housing financing right now, that's been historically an issue, a barrier to development in places north of Portland, is that the projects just don't pencil. Even if you have a low profit motive, which I personally do, you still need to make sure that the building doesn't lose money. So,
yeah, people like Cara and I end up putting very little value on our time. And I think that's the part, that we're trying to articulate here, is that, there's so many things that Cara and I end up looking at, and then they either slow down or they get confusing, and we spend a lot of time on them, and then they may just die, like Wade was talking about, or you may spend so much time on them, even though it appears to people that you did really well, and you made some money in the end. The amount of time that you end up spending getting to the starting line even can make it a very fundamentally unprofitable motive. I think everyone thinks that developers just always make a ton of money. That is really not the case in a lot of instances, sadly. I think the other interesting local tool is tax increment financing. You may have heard of TIFs before, and there is an affordable housing TIF program at the state level too, which is something that communities can commit themselves to if you can get that through, select boards and town meetings. That is another financing tool. And then that coupled, with what Becca was talking before about sort of putting restrictions on profiteering, essentially, right? And I think, I think the affordable housing TIF coupled with some of those restrictions is another interesting tool. I'll just, I think everybody knows we're facing a tremendous amount of inflation right now for building materials and labor and everything else. It's a difficult environment to do work in, but I think, again, it takes a little bit of time and effort. I mean, that's another thing that I think it's worth communities taking a look at is TIFs, and maybe if communities can sort of band together and agree on an approach, you could do it in a way where there's just some sort of a model policy that you try to put in place rather than trying to figure out everything one at a time.
So I'm sorry, Steve. I saw the hand, but it's 12:45, and I think we've been pretty good about these in the past. So I do want to wrap us up. And again, I'll acknowledge, we're having this conversation within the context of this Mahoosic Way Sustainable Tourism Initiative, which is, we don't really think of this as a tourism project, but I think what we're seeing in the Bethel area, and it's not just in Bethel, it's in Rangeley, it's in Greenville, it's in other we think of as rural destination communities, where you've got this different type of pressure on the housing stock than you do in some of the larger communities. So acknowledging that as we try to think really deeply about what does a sustainable tourism economy look like. It's not just about, good visitor experiences or reducing people's drivings, but it's really thinking about what is the community infrastructure and how do you embed and position a community to navigate this pathway. So it's interesting, even for us at the Northern Forest Center, we often think of the housing work as part of our broader community investment work, but in some of these communities, it really is part of, in our minds, part of a sustainable tourism development strategy, tourism recreation economy. So obviously this is a big issue that is going to continue. Again, based on everyone's participation here and past conversations, I think there is a lot of interest and some level of commitment to really dig into this and see what we can do to create some new options in the area. So with that, again, I know it leaves us hanging a little bit, but this is a conversation we could have for a very long time. So we are going to wrap it. I don't know if Cara or Brian, if you want to have any final words. I don't want to put you on the spot, but if you're sitting there thinking, oh, I just want to say this last thing, feel free. And otherwise, I would just say, again, thank you, Cara Wilbur and Brian Eng, for joining us today. And thanks everyone for taking the time out of your day to lean into this conversation. We'll be back in touch with another conversation next month. And we'll look for opportunities to follow up with Brian and Cara as these conversations continue in the Mahoosic region.
Thank you.
So
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, guys.
thank you, everyone.
Thanks.